All right, our final lesson in our statistics part of our unit for this is mean absolute deviations, the MAD, day 2. We're going to talk about some applications and take a look at some information of what we can figure out when we actually look at and compare some MADs here. So MAD of a set of data gives us more information about how consistent the data is. And if you remember from our box and whisker plot, we were able to see that visually, and then the MAD is just a number that's going to allow us to compare them. Unfortunately, just like on a box and whisker plot too, unless we actually have other sets of data that we can compare this to or other MADs we can compare it to, we can't really see how consistent our data is just in general for one set of data. We can look at the MAD and we can kind of just justify, oh, this number seems high or seems low, but we're not able to get the full picture or do a comparison really to see like how somebody else or something else compares to it. So consistency is here. We're going to be looking at that. We're looking for less variability, lower MAD, and consistent data most of the time. So for the MADs for our cookie stacking heights, our MAD, if you remember from the previous lesson, ended up being 3.78. I did some calculations in class 2 with the data that we used in the box and whisker plot gave us a MAD of 2.375. And class 3's MAD was 1.85 after rounding. And if you kind of remember back a couple lessons ago when we talked about box and whisker plot, class number 3's MAD was actually, or class number 3's box and whisker plot was a lot smaller. So I'll actually flip back to that real quick here. So these are our data sets that we're using in these video lessons. This is our class right here, and then when we look at class 2 and then class 3. And you can notice that our box and whisker plot was the largest, followed by class 2, and then followed by class 3. So it does make sense that since our box and whisker plots got smaller as we went up in classes, that we would expect our MADs to actually go lower. So what we can say here are a couple things. We can say that our class was not as consistent. We also had, if you remember, in our set of data, we actually had that 28, which was a pretty good outlier compared to some of our other data numbers that we had. We did jump from a 21 all the way up to a 28, so I would actually consider that an outlier. And outliers do, in fact, affect the mean. So it is kind of note to point out that we had an outlier, which then does affect the mean, which ultimately would affect your MAD as well. And taking a look at it, it kind of makes sense then that we had this outlier and it was affected. What we can say here too is that class number 3 was the most consistent when we're able to compare these 3 classes together. So they had most consistent, less what we call variability then with their numbers. So when we actually take a look at our data set, we can kind of get an indication for what might potentially happen with the MAD. And I'm going to show you that with this next example. So this is just a discussion question. It's Alyssa and Beverly scored the grades shown below on their last report card. Which girl had the overall higher average? What conclusions can you draw from the table? So real quickly, it's pretty easy to calculate an average. So we can go ahead and do that. So for Alyssa, we have 93 plus 62 plus 95 plus 94. And that gives us a total of 344. She had 4 subject areas, so if we divide by 4, her average is going to be an 86. Beverly has an 85, an 82, an 84, and an 85, which is a total of 336, also divided by 4 subject areas, and her average then is going to be an 84. So just looking down Alyssa's scores, it looks like something bad must have happened here. That this is really like a low D if we're looking at these as letter grades compared to all of her others being an A. And this is what we would also consider an outlier. So when you add this outlier into the mix, look at what it did to Alyssa's average. I mean, if you take that out, her average is going to be right in at a 94. But with this included, it brings it all the way down to an 86. So that outlier is going to cause her some issues. If I look at Beverly, her low score is an 82, but her high score is an 85, and there's 2 of them. That's only a range of 3. So that's a much lower range than Alyssa had. So thinking about what Beverly's box and whisker plot might look like, her box and whisker plot is going to be really small. So it is kind of note to say that. And it just so happens that we actually wouldn't even have enough data points to be able to create that, which is kind of crazy too. I guess we could. We would just have all of our numbers would be right bunched up next to each other here. So Looking at these, overall higher average, so we can say the higher average goes to Alyssa. And in theory, her average should actually be higher. And then it says, what conclusions can you draw from the table? Well, generally speaking, overall, Beverly is actually more consistent. All of her grades are within a couple points of another, whereas Alyssa is kind of a little bit more all over the place because of that language arts score. If we take that out, Alyssa's pretty much like Beverly in that everything's pretty relatively close to each other, the 93, 94, 95. We have a, range of only 2 there. So she's actually doing better than Beverly in terms of that if we take that outlier out then. So it would be good to note that Alyssa has an outlier. So overall, if we wanted to take a guess at whose MAD would actually be a lower number, you would be accurate if you said that Beverly's MAD would be lower. And that's because all of her scores are really close to what her average is, whereas Alyssa's scores have a drastic difference from where her average is. So next one, example number 4, again, this is just another discussion piece, kind of thinking about Alyssa and Beverly again. And I want you to come up with this one. And I'm going to ask you to type your response in here. Jared and Sarah earned the following scores on their last 5 tests, respectively. And these are not in order for you, so you may want to do that. But I want you to just kind of give me a little bit of information. What can you tell me about Jared's scores? What can you tell me about Sarah's scores? Who would be more consistent? And you're welcome to either write that out as a typed, either type it out if you would like to, or you're welcome to use a voice response on this one. But I'd like you to kind of think about what we just talked about with Alyssa and Beverly and talk to me a little bit about who's more consistent and who's going to be the more consistent student here.